If there were any cards in Yu-Gi-Oh that are just as iconic as the monsters, I'd say they would be the pot spell cards, mostly just Pot of Greed, but the other pots tend to make it into that fan favorite status. These are spell cards that usually give you more cards by allowing you to draw them or add them from your deck to your hand. They potentially could even take away cards from you. And they come in a variety of shapes and sizes, with untrustworthy looking faces on them. They're easy to identify, all having pot of in their name, or ending with nasubo in Japanese, with subo being Japanese for pot, not to be confused with the jar flip monsters which are called poto in Japanese, which also means pot, yet they're called jars in English, not to be confused with the jar trap cards based on the pot spells, but we're getting into etymology that we don't need to worry about. So to honor these funky looking ceramics, we want to look at the best Yu-Gi-Oh pot spells. Besides judging them based on their effects, we also want to look at their designs. There's a lot of excellent craftsmanship with this pottery that deserves to be praised, and to help me with that aspect of the list is the artist of many materials, Judgment Meter.
I've been stuck inside of a pot for 13 weeks. I'm out now.
Now, let's break open the top 10 pot cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! Number 10, Pot of Generosity. This card has you shuffle 2 cards from your hand back into the deck. That's it. This card is bad and you should never play it, but that's the point. It's supposed to be a parody of Pot of Greed, which famously lets you draw 2 cards from your deck, no strings attached. So instead of adding 2 cards from your deck to your hand, you're adding 2 cards from your hand to your deck. It's a funny parallel. It's actually 3 times as bad as Pot of Greed when you think about it, since Greed is a net gain of 1 card, losing 1 card by playing the pot but adding 2 cards, while Generosity is a net loss of 3 cards, losing the pot when you play it, and then the 2 cards that you shuffle back. The reason such a bad pot made this list is because it does exactly what it's meant to. It's a joke card, like the Humble Sentry. You're not supposed to take it seriously. Some people have tried to find ways to make it work with a deck that needs to shuffle back garnets, or uses spell counters, or just benefits from having less cards in the hand, but it's really just supposed to make you say, it's an anti-Pot of Greed, let's make fun of it. And that's okay, it was meant for that. It's like on my useless Pokemon move list when I said Splash wasn't the most useless move because it's meant to do no damage and have no effect. Yes, it's bad, but that's its purpose. They say up front, this move is bad, it won't do anything. Pot of Generosity is just the lovable Magikarp of the Yu-Gi-Oh pots.
Don't be mean.
That's not an insult. Who doesn't like Magikarp?
Probably a lot of people, because Magikarp doesn't do very much.
Well, yes, but do you know what Magikarp can eventually do?
Gyarados?
Exactly.
But what does this turn into?
Just wait for later on this list. There's something. Number 9, Pot of Benevolence. This is another bad pot effect, but unlike Generosity, I don't think they were intentionally goofing around with this effect. It's just too slow. It lets you target 2 cards in either graveyard and shuffle them back into the deck. It's meant to either help you recycle cards that you can search again, or remove cards from your opponent's graveyard that they would need later in the duel as combo pieces. However, since we had this effect in a trap card with the Transmigration Prophecy, and there was already quick effects like DD Crow that banish from your opponent's graveyard faster, there were better ways to pull off effects like this that you could chain, but I do respect Pot of Benevolence for trying to help out. Look at this guy. How could I be annoyed at this face?
No, it's cute. I like it. He looks like he has horse hooves.
No, he's not a horse.
What do you have against horses?
I'm just saying, last time we combined a horse with anything in Yu-Gi-Oh, we got this abomination. I also like that his effect specifically says to banish it after using it instead of sending it to the graveyard. I don't get why they did that. Is the effect too powerful? Are they afraid that we're going to get it back with Magician of Faith? I like to imagine that instead of throwing out the pot after using it, it just explodes. This part of the effect reminds me of Pot of Greed's original Japanese text, which says to destroy the card after using it, since it wasn't officially established that normal spells already go to the graveyard after use in the very early card game. It's also worth noting that he kind of got a new form with Pot of Dichotomy, where instead you shuffle 3 monsters with different types from your graveyard back into the deck and then draw 2 cards and skip your battle phase. It sounds better than it is, since 3 different types of monsters became a more difficult requirement to hit as decks became more archetype focused. As for the design, this is when Konami started fusing together the pots visually instead of making fully new pots, and Benevolence got combined with Pot of Average Avarice, who we'll certainly be seeing later on this list. No matter how reformed his body is, I don't know what's going on with his shape now, nothing's gonna stop Benevolence from keeping his classic pose.
Oh, I like that one. He's like, get me out of here. I don't want to be with this weirdo. And the other guy's like, doing my prayers.
Number 8, Pot of Riches. Whoa, a pot full of guys named Richard. This pot's pretty cool. I may not play pendulum decks, but I like that they got their own pot. This card lets you shuffle 3 pendulum monsters from your extra deck or graveyard back into the deck, and then you draw 2 cards. For the players out there who haven't kept up with the game, pendulum monsters can be played as monster or spell cards, and they go into the extra deck rather than the graveyard when they leave the field, so your extra deck is usually full of pendulum monsters that you can resummon later in the duel when your deck gets going. Generally, you want your pendulum monsters to stay in the extra deck when not on the field, but if you have an excess amount of them in there, or if you need a desperation draw, this card makes a good use out of them. It's also nice that you can shuffle pendulum monsters from your graveyard with this effect in case you lose them to something like a discard cost. And I love the design of this pot. Most of the pots are just posing for us where we can only speculate what they can do, but Riches is actively doing something. He's absorbing everything in the nearby radius with his high-intensity nose breathing. I guess that's how he found all his riches.
You can get a coffee bean stuck up your nose if you're doing that.
Why specifically coffee beans?
If it's bigger than an elbow, it doesn't belong. Oh wait, that's your ear.
He's not the only pot with a strong nose. Pot of Greed has some good nostril firepower on Counter Cleaner. What I want to know is, who's using the fork and spoon with Pot of Riches? Are those removable or just for show? Can I put my beef stew in his head and eat it immediately afterwards? And if they're not removable, that's an interesting design choice. It's like displaying fancy plates that you can never eat on.
Aw, he's ready for Din Din. It's good to be prepared.
Number 7, Pot of Acquisitiveness. Ooh, this guy's a quick play spell. I already love him. No other pots are quick play spells, so he has that unique factor about him. He targets 3 banished monsters on either side of the field, shuffles them back into the deck, and then you can draw 1 card. It's a neat little effect. Decks banish cards a lot in the modern game, so it has some niche usage. Maybe Metaphys or Sword Soul could find a use for it. I don't know. No one has ever advocated for this card to me, but I'm like Marge Simpson in this scenario, where I just think it's neat. I want to see this funky guy used more often. Besides the unique effect, I think his design has the most going on of all the pots, which I like. The shape is obtuse, the coloration is cool, and he's got a whole bunch of features, like the curly cues below the eyes, the earrings, the big nose that's mostly a sphere, and the lines below his nose that make it look like he has a pencil-thin mustache. Also, I like its tongue, which is blue like an Ed, Edd n Eddy character. I can't tell if it's drooling or if that's just a messy paint job. Regardless, doesn't this make you want to say, wow, that guy sure is acquisitive?
I don't even know what that means. I know what inquisitive, what is acquisitive?
Well, the dictionary defines it as excessively interested in acquiring money and or material things.
He wants those fat wads of dough.
No, he doesn't have any interest in baking bread.
Not that kind of dough, you fool. Stacks of cash. Are all of these words just synonyms for greed?
Kinda, yeah.
Got it.
Number 6, Pot of Avarice. Pot of Avarice was the original replacement for Pot of Greed after it got banned. It lets you draw 2 cards, but first you have to target 5 monsters in your graveyard, shuffle them back into the deck, and then you can draw your 2 cards. When I first saw this card when it came out, I was like, this is amazing! You draw 2 cards and take things out of your graveyard? How is this legal? And then I realized how important graveyard advantage is, and how hard it can be to get 5 monsters into your graveyard to begin with. In an era when chaos monsters needed monsters in the graveyard to banish, and more cards were letting you special summon from the graveyard or use monsters from the graveyard for material, using Pot of Avarice may have been a difficult decision that turns off other strategies to draw those 2 cards. Plus, you might not even want to redraw some of the cards that you'd have to put back into your deck, and if you draw Avarice early in the duel, you may not even have 5 monsters to shuffle back, making it a dead card, so the trade-off varies. Though if you play a deck that dumps monsters into the graveyard fast, like Danger or Dark World, or have a lot of extra deck monsters in your graveyard that reduces the number of cards that needs to go back into the main deck, Avarice is a good tech option. Since Avarice was the first new pot that wasn't a joke, coming out in 2005, I feel like they went all out with the visual design, showing us how wacky these new pots could be.
Does he have an apple slicer on his head?
I don't actually think we've ever seen him from above, so I can't definitively say no. Do you think he uses his long tongue to grab cards out of the graveyard and then spit them back into the deck?
No, it gives me icky vibes. Bad, icky feels.
But that doesn't answer my question. Does it grab cards with its tongue from the graveyard?
I don't know, but it makes me feel wet and sticky looking at it. I don't want to feel wet and sticky.
If you think that's bad, his nose is perpetually dripping because it's a jewel stuck to his nostril. He's also the only pot that can grow hair, since no other pot has a mustache like that. And these features carried over to his spin-off versions, similar to what Pot of Greed got, further cementing why he was the number 2 guy at the time. Where Avarice gets a jar and Moreira form. Avarice actually looks pretty good as a jar, all gold and shiny with his weird cheeks. His mustache is also a jewel now. Number 5, Pot of Greed. What? The original pot is only at number 5? What is this blasphemy? Well, sometimes I like to put the most iconic at number 1, but other times I like putting the trendsetter right in the middle of the list since it helps me explain later entries, and that's what I felt here. Pot of Greed established what these pots can do, but future pots built on what Greed introduced to make it more balanced. That's the real problem that doesn't get Pot of Greed number 1. It's too good. Well, that's a joke reason, but the card was so good it had to be banned, and it's on a bunch of other pot cards, so I wanted to get the Pot of Greed entry done before talking about the other pots that he's involved with after he got banned.
It's still banned. What does this card do?
It lets you draw 2 cards, no extra requirements, no fancy restrictions, just play the card, draw, that's it.
What's wrong with that? That sounds awesome.
No, that's big. You get 2 cards for free and only lose 1 card, being the pot. Getting a +1 in card advantage with a card that replaces itself for free can make or break games, so later pots added restrictions or changed the way you can add cards to your hand to make the effect not as easy to get.
But it's not like you have a bajillion of them. You only have usually 1. What, do you have like 45?
No, even if you have 1 Pot of Greed in your deck, that potential draw 2 could be just strong enough to be overpowered.
2 is too many. Alright, got me there.
Maybe I'm overselling Pot of Greed too much, but it's hard not to. It's Pot of Greed. Even without its super good effect, the design is ingrained in the heads of all Yu-Gi-Oh fans, and even non-Yu-Gi-Oh fans. Konami's never gonna let us forget him with how many cards he appears on.
I like that it's there because it's iconic and I notice it and it's easy for me to point out.
I like cards when he has a form beyond the pot, like Avatar of the Pot.
Oh my god. He is ripped. Bounce a quarter off of that. Whole bag of change. He'd probably like that. I won't take anything less than $50. I will dance for a 5.
Even when he's shown to be literally broken on cards like Return or Cash Back, he's got that constant smile on his face, except in Jar Robber. I'm a little distraught seeing him with a sad face there.
That was the precursor to let all the fans know that it was going to be banned. Bye-bye. Now you know what really happened to Pot of Greed.
So despite being out of the game for over 15 years, Pot of Greed's always going to have a legacy on other artwork, and in an age where the former big bans like Yatagarasu or Change of Heart are off the ban list now, some people want to see Pot of Greed off the ban list as well, since we have Omni Negates and Ash Blossom now. Surely nothing can go wrong, and I have no idea if that was facetious or not. Maybe the game is advanced enough for a single Pot of Greed, but I'm ready to be the guy eating cereal meme when I say they'll never unban Pot of Greed. Number 4, Pot of Duality. I love Pot of Duality. It was the first of these pots that combined 2 other pots visually, coming out in 2010, and I like the mechanic it contributed to the pot card game. You look at the top 3 cards of your deck and add one of them to your hand. Going 3 cards into your deck makes you feel invincible, like that's the 3 chances you have to get your combo going, but then you realize you have about 30 more cards in your deck, so it's a toss-up if you'll see something useful. Like half the time you'll see at least one good card, but a third of the time it's like 2 more of the pot and a trap card that loses its surprise because your opponent can see the cards that you're looking at. But regardless, it's a handy card in the right deck, though it comes with a restriction. You cannot special summon the turn that you use this card. From the time this card came out in 2010 to now, special summoning is a vital part of many decks. Because of that, this card doesn't see much play in your average deck today. It was used a lot when it first came out, until people realized the restriction sometimes nullifies the card search. But it's found a home in decks that give you extra normal summons without needing to special summon, like Fluanderees or Monarchs, and in decks that summon off of traps, like Dinomorphia, where you use the pot, summon your Dino, and then you do all the special summoning on your opponent's turn with your fusion traps. The card is used in moderation. Now the artwork has that oddly satisfying feeling, where 2 differently shaped pots form a new vase-like entity, and I like that the inaugural combined pot uses the polar opposite pots, being greed and its parody, generosity. In fact, in Japanese, for all the combined pots, they don't have a new name, they're just directly named after the 2 pots that make them up, so this card's name translates to Pot of Greed and Humility, with Pot of Generosity's name being Pot of Humility in Japanese. Though, I like how Duality and the rest of the combined pots get a new name in English to signify that these 2 contrasting pots create a completely different material.
It looks like he has the devil on his back, and that's what he's kind of smug about. He's like, I'm presenting really chill, but if you tick me off, I'm gonna turn around and bite you in the butt because I can, and you deserve it. Okay?
Yes, sir, Mr. Pot, sir.
Okay.
Did you know that there's actually a backstory to how these pots got broken? On the trap card Asleep at the Switch, Dream Clown and Swarm of Scarabs, weird character combo, are sneaking into the Tyrant Emperor's base to hit both of the pots with a hammer, and I'm assuming they're successful since we have Duality now.
What a jerk. He was taking a much-needed coffee break. That's important.
No, he's a ruthless tyrant. He doesn't deserve a break.
Oh, well, does the clown have a spider hanging from his crotch?
No, that's just one of the scarabs.
Oh, that makes sense. Okay.
And I guess afterwards, the tyrant discards the broken pot pieces, and a merchant picks it up to fix it, and then sells it to the Goblin of Greed for his broken pot of greed, who later regrets his purchase. Wait, if the merchant is taking in the broken pot of greed and has the pot of duality, does that mean that he just takes in the broken pots and makes these combined pots, explaining the origin of all of them? Ooh, we have a potentially extended backstory to explore later. Number 3, Pot of Extravagance. Pot of Extravagance is one of the closest things we have to Pot of Greed in the modern game. It's got some requirements to activate and a restriction, but those may not matter to certain decks. Banish 3 or 6 random cards from your extra deck face down, and then draw 1 or 2 cards respectively from your deck. You can only activate this right at the start of the first main phase of the turn that you're in, so you can't try to bait out something like an Ash Blossom first with a different card that lets you add cards to your hand, unless you got something to activate in the standby phase. You're either potting or nodding when that main phase starts, so at worst, you banish part of your extra deck to use up one of your opponent's potential negates. You also can't use effects that let you draw cards after using this, but you can still search and add cards with effects such as Reinforcement of the Army, so it's not that bad of a restriction, unless you somehow want to pull off a Hyper Librarian combo with half your extra deck banished. Basically, everyone banishes the 6 cards with this effect for the free draw 2, since this card is most popular in decks that don't need to utilize their extra deck, which tend to be underdog decks in modern times who could use a Pot of Greed, like Ultra Athlete, War Rock, or Monarch, but also Fluanderees, who's probably the best deck that can use Extravagance. Flu loves its pots. Essentially, if you never need to worry about what's in your extra deck, this is just an old-fashioned Pot of Greed that you can only use at a set point of the turn, and I still think that's pretty cool. As for the design, it's Pot of Greed and Riches. Never expected Pot of Riches to join the other pots since he was doing his own thing with the Pendulum monsters, but I'm glad Pot of Greed gave him some company.
I like that dude. He's chill and happy, or just really smug.
This combo pot also looks the most natural. Like with the other combo pots, you can see where they were fused together, but with this one, it just blends the two into each other. I think it's cause Pot of Greed has his full rim and was only broken below it. He just patched up his empty spot with this dude's face. This one also has the coolest background. It's like it's being forged in fire.
It's actually Hellfire. He's come to aid the war.
What war could these guys possibly fight? It's fine, I'm glad they're working together.
Aw, buddy.
Number 2, Pot of Prosperity. Pot of Prosperity is a more controlled version of Pot of Extravagance. You still banish 3 or 6 cards from your extra deck face down, but you get to choose the cards that you banish, so it works better with decks that need specific monsters in the extra deck that you don't want to risk on the Extravagance lottery. You don't draw 2 cards though. Instead, you then excavate the top cards of your deck equal to the number that you banished, and you pick 1 card to add to your hand. You only get 1 card regardless of how many you banish, so the extra reward of banishing 6 is having more cards to choose from. Since you have a choice of what to add rather than just drawing randomly like you do with Extravagance, it's actually better in many scenarios, despite only getting 1 card out of it. As with Extravagance, you can't draw cards via effects during the turn that you use this card, and Prosperity has the added restriction that all damage that turn that your opponent takes is halved, so no OTKs unless you can get 16,000 points of damage on the field. As for the design, I feel like these 2 pots aren't a perfect match. Generosity hanging out with Riches, I'm not sure if I could see Generosity hanging out with someone who isn't Greed. I feel like you need to be a serene pot to stick with Generosity. Greed can stay calm, but Riches seems like he would constantly try to talk to you when Generosity is just trying to meditate.
That's like having a really annoying roommate or forcing an annoying roommate onto somebody. It's like, here, now you have to deal with them, but forever.
Yeah, but it got a pretty good effect from it.
But at what cost?
Yeah, just 3 to 6 extra deck monsters.
But at what cost?
Also, the top of their rim is bent. I feel like this connection was too forced.
It looks like it would glow in the dark.
With only 11 pots in the real-life card game at the time of this video's release, and the Pot of Benevolence entry including Pot of Dichotomy, we don't need any honorable mentions, but here's a few related cards. Jar of Greed. This was the weaker trap version of Pot of Greed, where you only draw 1 card. This was used a lot back in the day just because it was an extra draw, but now it's been power crept and is really only used in decks that rely on draw power, like Exodia. Also Fortune Fairies if you figure out how to play them. I like how Jar of Greed was the original sequel to Pot of Greed, being the second pot-like entity introduced. He even got his own turtle. Pot of the Forbidden. This is a jar-style flip monster with a Pot of Greed effect and various other forbidden spell effects. I spoke about it in more detail on my second weird flip monster list, where one of my co-hosts wanted to stick his hand in it and another wanted to eat its eye, so check out that entry to find out why. And Pot of Arrogance. This pot is exclusive to the spin-off game Rush Duel, where it lets you draw 2 cards, but you can't activate any other spells that turn, which sounds pretty strong. If this was in the main card game, I feel trap-focused decks would make this an instant staple. Hell yeah, Dinomorphia. Just giving the pot hands lets it emote so much more in this single pose.
And look at his eyebrows. He's like looking at you like, I don't give an F what you're saying.
Also, the tiny mustache and goatee is wonderful. For the top pick, we went with the pot that gives you the least restrictions for your Pot of Greed experience, but still has a hefty price. Number 1, Pot of Desires. No choices have to be made once you activate this pot. You don't have to pick how many cards you want to banish, you don't have to choose any cards, you just play it, pay its cost, and draw 2, unless you get Ash Blossomed, but assuming you don't, let the good times roll. The cost? Banish the top 10 cards of your main deck face down, and draw your 2 cards stress-free. Or, not really stress-free, but you get to draw 2 cards. The fun, dangerous game of using this effect is banishing 10 cards is a lot. You have no control over what's being banished, so you could banish extra copies of cards in your deck and draw the copies that you didn't banish, or you could banish every card that you need and the draw 2 is now useless. It's really a roulette of determining if the risk is worth the reward, and in the right deck, it is. You tend to run multiple copies of the best cards in your deck, so probability states that you're less likely to banish what you need if you have more copies of it. Of course, worst case scenario shows that you'll banish all 3 copies and just draw 2 more Pot of Desires, which is the worst outcome since you can only play 1 Pot of Desires per turn. Then of course there are decks with cards on the limited list or don't need to play 3 copies of certain cards, so the effect has that left arm offering or Card of Demise feel where you're giving up a lot for that end result. Also, you're banishing face down, which means you can't access those cards with effects that recover banished cards, except with something like Necroface, but people mostly just use use his second effect. Though, for Pot of Desires, decks that use monsters that get boosted by banished cards, face up or face down, like Grenmaju or Sword Soul, find a silver lining in that cost, unless you banish all 3 of your Grenmaju when activating it, but just don't worry about that. Another reason I like this card at number 1, it visually combines the 2 main solo pots, Greed and Avarice. These were the 2 heavy hitter pots, and now they're back together to cause some chaos and draw some cards.
No, I don't like this bunch. They're not good together. They need to sit on opposite sides of the room.
Why is Greed gonna cause mischief with Avarice, but not with Riches when they combined into Extravagance?
I don't trust these dudes either. I feel like they would make a plan, though. The other guys would just, like, destroy everything in chaos, but at least, like, world domination versus chaos.
So which duo would you welcome as our new overlords?
That's a hard question.
So for letting us play the most dangerous of games to draw cards, and giving us 2 for the price of 1 with iconic Yu-Gi-Oh faces, Pot of Desires tops this list. Now, what did you think? Are all these pots worthy of purchase, or should Pot of Greed gotten number 1 for his impact? What are your favorite pot cards overall, either for effect or aesthetic? Let us know in the comments. Anyway, thank you all for watching, and we will see you in the next video.